Did you know that between 1895 and 1937, 93 men were executed behind the walls of Folsom Prison? But their stories, they weren't lost to time. They just needed a voice. Welcome to Falling Through the Trap, where we dive into the deep, often unsettling waters of historical true crime, as well as our criminal justice system, both past and present. I'm April Moore, author and criminal justice professional, and I invite you on a journey through the human stories buried in prison records, newspaper headlines, courtroom transcripts, and so much more. I'm not just recounting cases. I'm probing into justice's paradoxes and presenting humanity found in a place we're told there isn't any: prison. Through the stories of these 93 men, we'll look at history, ethics, and certainly the death penalty, and whether or not it should have a place in America's present and future. Hi there. I'm happy to have you along. Can you believe this isn't a long one? Maybe you're relieved. I know I kind of am, especially since I'm also releasing 2 bonus episodes tomorrow, a part 1 and 2. The first one's free, and part 2 will be on Patreon. Today I'm going to tell you about Frank Haines. In my book, Folsom's 93, I refer to him as Frank Miller. That was the name he used, and it was the name on official court documents, such as that from the California State Supreme Court. On the back of his mugshot, however, it reads Haines, Haines, and I did confirm that was his real name. Actually, his real name was Francis Marion Haines, and he was executed at Folsom on September 26, 1902. Little could be found about Haines prior to 1898, which is probably how he wanted it. That's why one would pick a common last name like Miller for an alias. I do know he was from Maryland, and according to testimony later on, he was made to leave home at 19 on account of his dishonesty. From there, he allegedly spent 3 years confined in Madison Barracks in Saginaw Harbor, New York, for horse stealing. In July of 1898, Haines is 36, and in Amedee, California, in Lassen County, in the northeastern part of the state bordering Nevada. The town sat on the east side of Honey Lake, and a steamboat was a conduit for commerce for farmers and ranchers, and thanks to some hot springs and a railroad terminus in 1891, Amedee became a boom town. Along with many businesses and a post office, the town boasted 2 hotels, the Pioneer Hotel and the beautiful Amedee Hotel, both owned by Louis Brubeck. So a fun fact, Louis Brubeck was the grandfather of the legendary jazz pianist and composer Dave Brubeck, who was born in 1920. Now, the railroad back then, you could say, had a bit of a god complex. It would giveth and taketh whenever it wanted. And so when it expanded in about 1899, it closed the terminus in Amedee, making it terminal, slowly dying for the next 50 years until someone bought it in 1950 for a whopping $32. But back in the 1890s, the town was bustling. The Amedee Hotel was known for being a rowdy place, given that some of its clientels were, quote, bronco busters or cowboys. In 1894, a 17-year-old girl named Maude Bentel, who worked as a telegraph operator for the hotel and would also pitch in as a waitress, died by suicide in the hotel after being harassed and threatened by one of these drunk cowboys. She was allegedly terrified by what he said to her, and no one came to her defense. In fact, it was reported that the, quote, man in charge of the hotel, not sure if that meant Louis Brubeck or a kind of manager, egged on the cowboy. She took some strychnine and died. The cowboy, Charles Ball, was charged with disturbing the peace and fined $200. Louis Brubeck was charged with conducting his hotel in a disorderly manner, a misdemeanor, and charged $200. 4 years later, on July 25th, 1898, another unfortunate incident occurred in the hotel, and coupled with the fate of the railroad terminus there, Louis contemplated his future as a hotelier, and he sold it in 1900. He packed up his big family and headed to Contra Costa County, where Dave Brubeck's parents met and a jazz legend was born. So it worked out for them, but not so much for Charles Sailing. He and his two other cowboy friends, Will Chapman and Frank Haines, came to the hotel's bar and proceeded to get fairly intoxicated. As the Sacramento Bee wrote, "Bad whiskey makes bad men." Because Chapman and Sailing started fighting, actual fist fighting. No one interfered, and the two beat the snot out of each other until Sailing yelled, "Enough." They went and washed up and then came to dinner, but evidently a truce hadn't been made, and the two went at it again. The papers saying that Charles Sailing got the worst of it. So he left, went to another saloon, and came back with a gun. He found Chapman in the washroom, but then Frank Haines appeared, carrying a double-barrel shotgun, and reportedly said that he allowed no man to impose on a friend of his before firing 2 shots at him, one into Sailing's heart, and another that, quote, tore away the lower part of his face. Frank was arrested and claimed self-defense, but in November, a jury found him guilty of first-degree murder, and he received a life sentence at San Quentin. I wasn't able to locate any records of the trial or find out much of anything regarding Chapman or Sailing. Haines appealed his conviction, and the following June, the state Supreme Court agreed that he was unfairly tried. A juror should have been excused for bias because he admitted he had heard and read about the case prior to the trial. Haines was granted a new trial, but chose to plead guilty to manslaughter, and this got him a 7-year sentence. You'd think he'd be fairly happy with that, but he wasn't quite ready to go back. In mid-September, on the train back to San Quentin after resentencing, about 1.5 miles away, Haines figured now or never. He asked the sheriff to take him to the water closet, or the restroom, which he did, but the sheriff kept his knee in the door to prevent Haines from locking it. He came back out just as the conductor came through the outer door of the car, and Haines saw his chance. Despite wearing an Oregon boot, an escape-preventing device I talk about in episode 5, and handcuffs, Haines made a break for it, throwing himself through the open door and onto the ground. The train was traveling about 20 miles per hour and going around a bend at the time. The train immediately stopped, and the sheriff was first to find Haines, lying on the ground with his head in a ditch, his leg broken at the ankle thanks to the boot. It had to have been a very desperate move, maybe a suicide attempt, because even if he had not been injured and escaped so close to the prison with the boot on, would have been fairly short-lived. He was taken to the hospital, treated, and then began his new sentence at San Quentin. About a year later, in early October of 1900, Mr. and Mrs. Mueller found their daughter Mary, whom they had been searching all over the state for, working in a Fresno prostitution house and addicted to morphine and opium. She was 17, and it was her 29-year-old husband of 1 year, Jerry Harris, who arranged her situation. The local paper wrote of Harris, "He bore the reputation of being a lazy, good-for-nothing fellow whose boast was just that he had not worked in years." The couple had already been run out of Bakersfield and Los Angeles, and evidently Mary wasn't the first girl he had done this to. It was his thing. He was a pimp. Upon his arrest, he reportedly told officers that the way to keep a woman, to prevent her from going off with another man, was to make a dope fiend out of her. He was arrested, charged with, quote, allowing his wife to enter a house of prostitution, a felony, was found guilty and sentenced to 10 years in San Quentin. I would have liked to have found out what happened to Mary, but like all the others in this case, there were just too many with the same last name. In March 1902, both Jerry Harris and Frank Haines worked in the jute mill at the prison. Prisoners sewed bags that jute farmers in the area used. Harris and another inmate had complained to Ernest Thompson, a trustee, or as he was referred to then as the con boss in charge of the mill, that Haines wasn't pulling his weight and making more work for Harris. These complaints had been going on for a few days, and on March 13th, Thompson confronted Haines about his alleged poor work habits and who had complained. Haines at this time had reportedly been a quiet, hard-working prisoner, a little moody, but a, quote, good con. So it likely came as a shock to Thompson when Haines grabbed a cast iron bar that was nearby and beat Thompson over the head several times, rendering him unconscious. Haines then turned around to where his coat was hanging and fished a knife out of one of its pockets and ran to an adjoining room where Harris was leaning back in his chair, sewing jute bags with some other prisoners. Haines rushed at him and stabbed him 6 times in the chest and abdomen. Harris had no time to react or ward off the attack. When Haines finished, he calmly wiped the blade on his pants, then tossed it at the feet of a guard who had just arrived. Haines made no resistance and was locked up in solitary. Harris died less than 20 minutes later. Ernest Thompson, the man he beat with a metal bar, was severely concussed, but he did survive. One report said Haines claimed he couldn't remember anything that happened. Another said that he exhibited no remorse, but said he was justified in his actions, though wouldn't give any reason. Haines pleaded not guilty, and at his preliminary hearing, he offered no defense, and trial was set for the end of May. But Haines refused to accept any court-appointed counsel, insisting he act as his own attorney. And this was a novel thing then, the papers remarking that the only other time they'd heard of a defendant refusing counsel was some case in Chicago a few years prior. It baffled everyone. And it was certainly in Haines's right to refuse an attorney, and Judge F.M. Angelotti, who would later serve on the state's Supreme Court, instructed the sheriff to assist Haines in issuing subpoenas and gathering evidence. But not only refusing legal aid, he said all lawyers were villains, but he was also refusing to interact at all. And when the judge asked him if he wished to change his plea, he refused to answer. So the judge entered a plea of not guilty for him. His refusal to engage was seen as an attempt to simply delay proceedings and inconvenience the court. He was examined by doctors and deemed perfectly sane. Finally, on June 20th, 1902, Haines insisted on being brought into court. He proceeded to tell the judge that there were irregularities during his preliminary examination, that documents didn't have the proper seals on them, and that several witnesses had not been sworn in. The court examined these records, and it was shown that neither was to be true. He further claimed his original conviction was a setup, a plot by authorities. His trial finally began in late June, and Judge Angelotti did have an attorney, a Mr. Hawkins, present in the courtroom in case Haines changed his mind. But Haines shook a finger at the judge and said, "Mr. Hawkins will not dare touch the case, and you shall not allow him to do so." During jury selection, Haines appeared sullen and completely disinterested in the proceedings. He sat back in his chair and chewed tobacco. He had a right to question the jurors, and even though District Attorney McIsaac challenged several, Haines would merely wave his hand to signify his acceptance of them. He did the same when Judge Angelotti explained to him he could question or challenge a juror. So once the jury was secured, Haines did demand that the information be read, and when asked if he accepted it, he replied no, but refused to give a reason why. The prison's doctor was first to testify, and on cross-examination, Haines pointed a pencil at the witness and asked him if he had been present at the preliminary hearing. He was, and if he had been sworn in. Again, he said he had. Haines asked the doctor, "Do you know you are under oath?" "I do," he replied. Haines then waved his hand at the doctor to dismiss him from the witness stand. When an inmate testified to seeing Haines rush into the room and stab Harris, Haines just laughed, then waved him away to show he had no intention of cross-examining him. He did the same to Ernest Thompson, the man he assaulted, and with many other witnesses. Then guard Jack Connell testified, and Haines asked him the same questions he asked the doctor before dismissing him with a nonchalant wave of his hand. Then a brother of Haines's testified and said that the defendant was a tough, or basically a thug, a jerk, and that if $1 would save his life, he wouldn't give it to him. Certainly no brotherly love there. Throughout the trial, Haines drew illustrations of knives, guns, and prison gates. Over a picture of a gun, he wrote Thompson's name. Under a drawing of a knife, he scribbled the guard's name. Referring to the drawings, the San Francisco Chronicle wrote, "The man seemed to gloat over his crimes, and his mind seemed crammed with murder." Haines didn't offer any defense, no witnesses, and he didn't testify on his own behalf. So not a surprise that the jury found him guilty, only 20 minutes after retiring. The San Francisco Examiner wrote, "The men on the jury stated they considered him a hardened wretch and that it was their duty to remove him from society." The paper continued, "The trial was the shortest and most singular of its kind in the history of California, while the record is pronounced by Judge Angelotti and the district attorney to be the blackest in the annals of the court. The judge conducted the trial with great care, and when the district attorney at times overstepped the rules of evidence, the court promptly interfered." Perhaps that's what Haines' objective was. One, to appear incompetent, but without counsel to object on his behalf, the prosecution or judge could later be found guilty of misconduct, and he'd get another trial. He did finally speak up in a letter he wrote to the Examiner saying that for the benefit of the people, he wanted to give them, quote, "an inkling of the behind the scenes of his case." But it really just made things more confusing. He wrote, "In Lassen County in 1898, I shot a man named Charles Saling in Amedee. The deed was done in self-defense, and such was my plea. The act was the outcome of a conspiracy existing against me that had its birth in Wyoming. As to those who figured in it in this coast, I am ignorant. Through some secret influence, a verdict of murder was brought against me in the Lassen County court." He claimed that on some pretense he was discharged and, quote, "railroaded to Wyoming so that certain parties could claim a reward offered for me." None of this made any sense. According to his letter, it was his understanding that the state Supreme Court's decision the following May was a reversal of his conviction, and that he was to be a free man. "But I was never released," he wrote. "In August 1899, Lassen County sent for me at San Quentin, and I was taken back to Susanville. I denounced my attorneys, and they became scared. I was taken into court after hours, and adjudged guilty of manslaughter on the same charge from which the Supreme Court had virtually released me. They tried to poison me that night and, failing, got me out of town before daylight and hustled me back to San Quentin. They said I was trying to play crazy and left me in there for 4 or 5 months. I heard that the town was burnt afterwards, so that all records and trace of their work was destroyed. The letters and affidavits they are now using to prosecute me with are forgeries. He was perhaps referring to the fire that destroyed most of Susanville, but that was in 1893, well before his trials there. He went on saying, "They are trying to murder me and make it appear it is my own doing. If the people of California will investigate my statements, they will find that I am the victim of an enormous legal crime. I feel that it is not the wish of the people that such things be done in their name, and as I have no money to engage counsel that I could trust, I plead with them to take up my cause." It was signed Frank Miller. It's impossible to know or really confirm what Haines was talking about, whether he truly believed it or deliberately was concocting some narrative. Either way, none of it was taken too seriously. On June 30th, he was sentenced to hang at Folsom on September 26th. Judge Angelotti had urged Haines to pursue his right to an appeal because refusing legal counsel wouldn't prevent his execution. The San Francisco Chronicle wrote that afterwards in the jail, Haines, quote, began to whistle and then to dance and sing. There was apparently no music or rhythm to the tune he hummed, but he kept up his weird exhibition until he was tired, when he became the Haines of old, sullen, vicious, but perfectly rational, endeavoring to swagger through a desperate case. By the time Haines had arrived at Folsom, death row had been empty for a year and a half, the first time since it welcomed its first occupant in 1894. George Putman, from the previous episode, had been executed in late 1900, but there was another man on death row. His name was Isaiah Zumwalt. He murdered several family members of his, and he was quite ill and died before his execution in March of 1901. An empty death row would only occur 3 more times during Folsom's execution history that ended in 1937. This was in 1906, 1916, and 1936. On September 15th, Judge Angelotti said he planned to ask Governor Henry Gage to issue a reprieve for Haines in order to determine the prisoner's sanity. According to one paper, Haines' unusual behavior had continued at Folsom, whatever that meant, and the judge was concerned. Haines' actions were unusual, unlike anything the California courts had ever seen. Again, no one refused counsel or to appeal their case, especially a death penalty case. He wasn't issued a reprieve, and I couldn't find any record of even a doctor examining him. On the day before his execution, clergyman, quote, had to leave his cell on account of his surly disposition. The San Francisco Call and Post wrote, Haines said today that the officials would never have the pleasure of hanging him by the neck. When taken to the bathroom today, he refused to remove his clothes, and turnkey Haggerty told Haines he would have to obey the rules of the prison. Haines resisted and struck Haggerty with the handcuffs which were upon his wrists. Several employees came upon the scene and pacified Haines for the time being. Captain Murphy expects to have trouble with Haines tomorrow. Captain of the Guard, R.J. Murphy, who was acting warden because Warden Thomas Wilkinson was quite ill at the time, gave his statement to the press. Since Haines' arrival at this prison, he has been very sullen, is abusive in his language to the prison officials, refuses spiritual consolation, and from present indications, he will try to be troublesome at the time of execution, and with that end in view, all necessary precautions are being taken. I think Murphy felt that way about every inmate. The next morning, Murphy claimed that when he went to the man's cell to see if he needed anything, he swung the door open and Haines tried to attack him, nearly murdering him with his handcuffed wrists. Haines was described as glaring savagely at the spectators while standing on the gallows, and that he tried in vain to free himself from the straps around his body and ankles. At 10:02 a.m., Haines fell through the trap and was declared dead after 13 minutes. Next time, I'll tell you about William Glover. We've all heard the old joke about dads sitting in a chair with a shotgun to intimidate their daughter's boyfriend. Well, what if it's the other way around? You'll want to hear that one. In the meantime, I hope you'll check out the bonus episodes where I dive into the very bizarre and brutal history of how California's penal system began. Falling Through the Trap is written and produced by me, April Moore. You can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and follow the show on Instagram at Falling Through the Trap. I'll post photos and other documents on the show page, apriljmoore.substack.com, where you'll also find links to YouTube and to Patreon, where I provide bonus material, including bonus episodes. I'll release 1 to 2 new episodes each month, always on Fridays, where you'll learn the story of the next man to fall through the trap at Folsom Prison.